They say that once you find yourself on Hollow Route 17, there's no turning back. Not without the rules. No one knows exactly where the highway starts or ends. It's said to stretch through the heart of nowhere, a place where reality thins. One evening, Jake found himself driving through a fog so thick that the world outside his car vanished. It was then his phone vibrated, displaying a message from an unknown number. Follow the rules. It's your only chance. The message was followed by a list. 1. Do not stop the car under any circumstances. No matter what you see, no matter who you think you hear, keep driving. 2. If you see a woman standing by the side of the road, do not look directly at her. Keep your eyes on the road and drive faster. 3. At exactly midnight, you will hear tapping on your window. Do not acknowledge it. Turn your music up or hum, but don't listen. 4. If your car stalls or breaks down, leave immediately. Walk for exactly 1 mile north. There you'll find a house. Enter without knocking. 5. Inside the house you will find a candle. Light it. The witch will come. She will offer you a choice. Choose wisely. Jake blinked at the screen, the fog still swallowing everything outside. His gut told him to turn back, but Hollow Route 17 had its own rules about that. He tried hitting the brakes. Nothing. The car seemed to have a mind of its own, cruising steadily into the unknown. The landscape outside began to change, shapes writhing within the fog, barely human forms flickering on the edge of his vision. He clenched the steering wheel, breathing heavily. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, right? But the hum of the car and the silence of the road told him otherwise. Rule 1 echoed in his mind. Do not stop the car. As the minutes dragged on, Jake noticed a figure up ahead, standing still on the shoulder. A woman. Her hair was wild and dark, her skin pale against the creeping night. She stood too still, her head tilted unnaturally toward his car. Rule 2. Do not look directly at her. His heart pounded as he stared straight ahead, resisting the overwhelming urge to turn his head. His peripheral vision caught the faintest flicker of movement. Was she stepping closer? The car surged forward as Jake pressed his foot hard on the gas. He didn't dare check if she followed. The road felt endless. The clock on his dashboard clicked over to 11:59 p.m. His heart raced. He knew what was coming next. The tapping. Jake gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, a soft, deliberate tapping began on the passenger window. He couldn't help it. His eyes flicked to the side, just for a second. There was nothing there, only darkness. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. He fumbled for the radio, cranking the volume to drown out the sound. But it slipped through the static, a slow, rhythmic knock. Then, without warning, a voice whispered through the speakers.
Let me in.
Jake's blood ran cold. He couldn't focus. He started humming, anything to block out the sound, anything to stop his mind from unraveling. The knocking faded, but the dread in his chest only deepened. Suddenly, the car lurched. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him in utter silence. The clock blinked 12:01 a.m. Rule 4. If your car stalls, leave immediately. Jake scrambled out of the car, the fog thick as smoke around him. His breath came in short gasps, but he forced his legs to move, walking north as instructed. The road behind him vanished into the fog, and the world around him warped into something unrecognizable. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches like bony fingers reaching toward him. Exactly 1 mile later, the house loomed out of the mist, a decaying 2-story structure with broken windows and a rotting porch. The door swung open without a sound as he approached. Inside, the air was cold, heavy with the smell of mold and decay. In the center of the room was an old wooden table and on it sat a single candle, unlit. His hands shook as he grabbed the matchbook resting beside it and struck a flame. The second the candle flickered to life, the house seemed to breathe. Shadows danced along the walls, and from the farthest corner of the room, she emerged. The witch. Her eyes were hollow voids, her mouth twisted in a cruel smile. She glided toward him, her presence suffocating, like the weight of 1,000 nightmares pressing against his chest.
Choose.
Her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind.
The candle burns, and with it, your time fades. Will you stay or will you run?
He swallowed hard. What happens if I choose wrong? Her smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp.
You'll stay with me, forever.
The flame flickered. His mind raced. If he stayed, she would devour him. But if he ran, she would chase him, hunt him down like the others who never made it off the highway. He had to make a choice, and fast. I run, he stammered. The witch hissed. A sound so unnatural it made his skin crawl.
Then run.
Jake bolted for the door, but the moment he stepped outside, the ground beneath him shifted. The fog swirled like living tendrils, and behind him, he heard the witch's laughter, low, guttural, and growing closer. His legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to drag him down. Ahead, the car was still there, but it seemed impossibly far. The mist swirled around him, shapes moving within it, faint figures that whispered his name, shadows that reached for him. The laughter was right behind him now. Her cold breath on his neck. He pushed harder, his heart pounding in his ears, his lungs burning. The car was just a few steps away, but the moment his hand touched the door, it slipped from his grasp. The witch was there, smiling at him through the glass. And the rules, they meant nothing to her. Jake was never seen again, just another lost soul on Hollow Route 17. But sometimes, on a foggy night, if you're unlucky enough to find yourself on that cursed highway, you might hear tapping on your window or see a woman in the mist. Just remember the rules. You'll need them. But no one ever said they'd help. Detective Hannah Myers stood on the edge of Hollow Route 17, staring into the thickening fog. Her hand rested on the hood of her unmarked car, the heat from the engine barely warming the chill in the air. Jake Donovan, the latest in a string of disappearances, had been driving down this same stretch of road. She wasn't one to believe in urban legends or ghost stories, but after months of dead-end leads and the uncanny similarities between the missing persons, the pattern was impossible to ignore. It always came back to Route 17. Jake had been the third person to vanish this year, all around the same stretch of road, all under the same eerie circumstances. She'd read the witness reports, the hushed whispers from those who lived nearby, locals talking about the witch. People said the road was cursed, that it twisted itself around you, dragging you into its darkness if you weren't careful. And once you entered the witch's territory, there was no turning back. But Hannah wasn't afraid of fairy tales. She'd faced real monsters before, flesh and blood ones. Still, something about the road felt wrong. The fog curled around her feet like something alive, and she could swear she heard faint whispers on the wind. She wasn't sure why she was there. Maybe it was desperation, another long shot. Or maybe it was because of the note she'd found on her desk that morning. No one had seen who left it, and there were no fingerprints on the paper. But the message was clear. Follow the rules. They're your only chance. The note had detailed a set of rules eerily similar to the ones that Jake had allegedly followed before he disappeared. 1. Do not stop the car. 2. If you see a woman on the road, keep driving. Do not look at her. 3. At midnight, you will hear tapping on your window. Ignore it. 4. If your car stalls, leave immediately. Walk 1 mile north and find the house. 5. Light the candle in the house. The witch will come. She knew these rules. Jake's friends had mentioned them, though they'd all thought it was a sick prank. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of the note were additional rules. New ones. 6. If the witch asks you a question, do not answer. She already knows the truth. 7. If you see a shadow moving outside the house before you light the candle, leave and walk east. It's your only chance to escape. 8. Do not look into the witch's eyes, no matter what she offers you. Hannah shuddered, reading the final rule. 9. If you make it to dawn, you may leave, but you will never be alone again. The detective folded the note and stuffed it into her coat pocket. Her gut told her to turn around, to get back in her car and head home. But she wasn't built that way. Jake's mother had called her almost every day, pleading for answers. The last thing Jake had said to anyone was that he was driving down Route 17. She had to follow through. It was her job. Hannah climbed into her car, started the engine, and pulled onto the deserted road. The fog swallowed everything, thickening until it was all she could see, like a living, breathing thing surrounding her. The headlights barely pierced through it, casting twisted shadows on the road. For miles, nothing happened. No signs, no landmarks, just the endless gray swallowing her whole. The dashboard clock blinked 11:45 p.m. She'd been driving in a straight line for over an hour, and her phone had lost signal almost as soon as she turned onto the road. Her heart began to race as the air turned colder, a biting chill seeping through the vents despite the heater blasting full force. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Suddenly, the fog ahead shifted, parting to reveal a figure standing impossibly still on the side of the road. A woman. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders, and she wore a white gown that looked far too clean for this place. She wasn't looking directly at Hannah, but her head was slightly tilted, as if she were listening for something. Hannah's pulse spiked. Rule 2. Do not look at her. Keep driving. Her instincts screamed at her to hit the brakes, but her foot pressed harder on the gas instead. She kept her eyes glued to the road, heart pounding in her chest as she sped past the woman. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw the woman take a step forward, her head snapping toward the car. But Hannah didn't dare look. She could feel her presence pressing against the passenger window as she flew past, her icy gaze following her. But she didn't turn her head. Moments later, she was gone. The clock hit 11:59 p.m. Hannah's breath came in short bursts. She knew what was coming next. The tapping. Her mind raced, and she reached for the radio, turning the dial until static filled the car. She needed something, anything, to drown out the sound she knew was coming. But it was too late. The first tap echoed against the window. Soft, deliberate. Hannah tensed, forcing herself not to look. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something wanted her to acknowledge it. Then came the whisper, barely audible over the static.
You can't hide forever.
Her throat tightened. She cranked the volume higher, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Don't listen. Don't look. She started humming under her breath, trying to block it out, her heart hammering in her chest. The tapping stopped. She let out a shaky breath, but then her car jerked violently. The engine sputtered, choked, and died. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. The fog closed in around her, and the silence was suffocating. Rule 4. Leave immediately. Walk 1 mile north. Hannah grabbed her flashlight and gun, threw open the door, and stepped into the fog. The air was thick with a damp, earthy smell, and every step she took felt like it echoed in the emptiness around her. She kept her hand on her gun, her eyes scanning the fog, but the road behind her had already vanished. She walked in silence for what felt like hours, but her phone told her it had only been minutes. The dense mist eventually parted to reveal a house. It was the same as the description. Old, rotting, windows shattered. The door stood ajar, creaking on its rusted hinges. She stepped inside. The air inside the house was stale, thick with dust and decay. The furniture was sparse, ancient, and crumbling, and in the center of the room, just like in the rules, sat a candle. Next to it was a box of matches. Her heart hammered as she struck a match, the small flame flickering to life. Just as she was about to light the candle, a shadow passed by the window outside. A flicker of movement, gone as quickly as it had come. Rule 7. If you see a shadow before lighting the candle, leave and walk east. Hannah hesitated. Could she trust the rules? Could she outrun her? The witch? She stared at the candle, debating for a moment too long. The door creaked behind her. A low, raspy voice filled the room.
You've come so far, but you already know what happens next.
Hannah turned slowly. The witch stood in the doorway, her hollow black eyes watching with something like amusement. She smiled, the corners of her mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth.
Shall we play a game, detective?
The witch whispered, stepping closer.
Or would you prefer to run?
Her eyes gleamed in the flickering light, and Hannah knew she had already made the wrong choice. She had broken the rule. The candle remained unlit. Now the witch stood before her, a shadow that no amount of light could dispel, her black eyes fixed on Hannah's every move. Time slowed as the witch's voice slithered through the room like a gust of cold air. She repeated herself and aggressively asked,
Shall we play a game, detective?
Hannah's hand hovered near her gun, but deep down she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The witch was not something that could be fought, not with bullets or reason. But her survival instincts were louder than her logic. She had to do something, anything. I'm not playing your game, Hannah said, her voice steady despite the terror clutching at her throat. The witch's smile widened.
You've already started, dear, and you're running out of time.
She tilted her head toward the candle.
You forgot something, didn't you?
The detective's pulse spiked. The rules. The candle. She had to light it. Her hand fumbled for the matchbook on the table. But before she could strike a match, the witch's cold, bony fingers wrapped around her wrist. The touch was like ice, freezing her to the bone.
You've made your choice,
the witch whispered, her breath like frost on Hannah's skin.
Now let's see if you're fast enough to regret it.
Without warning, the witch let go and melted into the shadows. The room darkened, the air thickening, and in the distance, Hannah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, many of them, all at once. They echoed from deep within the house, coming closer. Her instincts screamed. She ran. The hallway stretched out before her, impossibly long and winding, as if the house itself had expanded into a labyrinth of horrors. Every door she passed seemed to hold something behind it, a glimpse of movement, a whisper of voices, and the shadows. They shifted and reached for her. The footsteps were louder now, chasing her through the twisting corridors. She didn't dare look back. She could feel them, the witch's other victims trapped forever in this nightmare, their hollow faces twisted in silent screams. Rule 6. If the witch asks you a question, do not answer. Hannah cursed herself for engaging with her, but it was too late. The rules were unforgiving, and now the house was waking up. She skidded to a halt at a dead end. A narrow stairwell stretched downward, leading into a basement that smelled of rot and something older, something dead. The footsteps were right behind her now. She had no choice. Gripping the flashlight in one hand and her gun in the other, Hannah descended into the dark. The basement was cold, damp, and far too large to fit under the house. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved deep into the stone, and at the far end, standing impossibly still, was Jake. He looked exactly as he had in the missing persons report, disheveled, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something wrong. His skin was gray, too pale, and his eyes, they had no light behind them. "Jake," Hannah whispered, even though she already knew what this was. He didn't respond, didn't blink, just stared at her with those dead eyes. And then he spoke, his voice monotone, hollow.
You broke the rules.
Hannah backed away, her breath catching in her throat. "Don't answer." The rule played over and over in her mind, screaming at her to keep quiet, to turn and run. But the longer she stared at Jake, the more she could feel her resolve slipping. This was someone's son, someone she had promised to find. "Jake, I'm sorry," she started, but the moment the words left her mouth, the entire basement seemed to tremble. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly green light, and the floor beneath her feet shifted like something was moving below. Jake's head snapped to the side unnaturally fast, his mouth widening into a grotesque grin.
It's too late, Detective. She's already here.
The basement plunged into darkness. Hannah's flashlight flickered, sputtered, and died. And then, silence. Utter silence. No footsteps, no whispers. Nothing. Hannah stood frozen, her breath shallow. She knew she wasn't alone. The witch was nearby. Then came a voice from the shadows. It wasn't Jake's. It was something else, something far older and more malevolent. It echoed from every corner of the room, vibrating through her bones.
She's chosen you.
Hannah's blood ran cold. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed toward the stairwell, but it was gone. The walls had shifted, trapping her in this cursed place with no escape. The witch's laughter filled the air, cold and sharp, like knives scraping against stone.
You thought you could win, but the rules were never meant to be followed.
The darkness moved, coalescing into a figure, a shadow of the witch, her face barely visible through the thick black mist. Her eyes, hollow and endless, locked onto Hannah, and in her hand she held the unlit candle.
Light it, Detective. But know this. If you do, you'll burn with it.
Hannah swallowed, her mind racing. The rules. They were never about survival. They were a trap, a test to see how far she'd go before realizing the truth. There was no way out. No matter what she did, the witch would claim her, just as she had claimed Jake and all the others. But there was one rule left, one she hadn't broken yet. Rule 9. If you make it to dawn, you may leave, but you will never be alone again. Hannah glanced at the faint light filtering through a crack in the ceiling above her. Dawn was near. The witch stepped closer, her form shifting, stretching, becoming more monstrous with each passing second.
What's your choice? Will you light the candle or wait and see what I can do?
Hannah's hands trembled. Her mind screamed at her to light the candle, to try anything to escape this nightmare. But she hesitated. The witch's game was one of manipulation, of fear. Lighting the candle might only seal her fate. Time stretched thin, the seconds feeling like hours. The light in the crack above grew brighter, but the witch's presence pressed in on her, suffocating.
Make your choice.
Hannah stood frozen. She looked at the candle, then at the faint light of dawn creeping through the ceiling. She wasn't going to play the witch's game anymore. "I'm not lighting it," she said through gritted teeth. The witch's face contorted in rage, her form twisting and growing darker. She lunged at Hannah just as the first rays of sunlight hit the room, blindingly bright, flooding the basement with light. The witch shrieked, her form unraveling, dissolving into the shadows. Hannah dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. The The house trembled violently, the walls cracking, collapsing around her as the dawn broke through, driving the darkness away. She had survived. The witch was gone. But as Hannah stood on her shaky legs, the last rule echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. Rule 9. You may leave, but you will never be alone again. Hannah walked back into the light of the morning sun, her body bruised and battered, but alive. As she made her way back to her car, she felt it, the cold presence, the shadow that followed her every step. She had escaped Hollow Route 17, but the witch was with her now, always, watching, waiting. And no matter how far she went, Hannah would never be alone again.